The glue has dried now on my trays, and I've started sanding the top and bottom surfaces of these to get everything flat. There were some minor mismatches in some of the parts. So I'm using my block here, a piece of MDF with some sandpaper on it. This came from a wide belt sander. It's 80 grit, a little on the coarse side, but it was a little worn. So I'm just rubbing this on here. If I didn't have this bigger sheet, I could just use a regular 9x11 sheet of sandpaper to do the same thing. So I'm sanding it flush. I'm turning this often to make sure I'm doing it symmetrically. I'm not taking off more one corner, and I'll continue to do that until everything is flush. So I finish with light pressure and circular strokes, and that does a nice job of getting rid of the sanding scratches. So this looks pretty good, and I think I'm ready to start rounding the edges. So this is the, if I look at the edges here, remember I was trying to make sure the best edges are up. So this is the top surface. What I'll do, I'm not going to round any edges on the bottom. On the top, I'm only going to knock these corners down, not on the outside, right? Because this is going to be down inside the box. On this one, I'll pretty much round everything because this one might actually come out of the box. So all these edges are going to get touched at some point. On the top tray, I'm going to use 180 to start rounding these edges. And I can use my block here. Obviously, I can't really use it inside here, so I'll just use a loose piece of paper here. But where possible, I want to use the block just because it's a flatter surface. I'll get a little more consistent result here. And I don't want to round it too much. Just a few strokes with this 180 is going to be enough. And I want to do the bottom too, and then once I'm done with that, I'll take, this is also 180, and I'll come inside here and do the same thing. And I think I mentioned before, I really want to make sure I go right up to the corner. I want those edges knocked off consistently from one end to the other. So once I'm done with the 180, just knocking the edge, then I'm going to jump in here with 320 and finish and do a little more rounding, and that should be enough for the trays. So this is the 320 grit now. Then last, I just want to make sure these outer edges or corners are rounded, and I always like to, particularly these corners, because those can feel sharp when you're handling it. Okay, so I think I'm done with the top tray. So one thing I like to do when I'm done sanding something is just feel all the corners, and your fingers are going to do a better job at telling you if everything's good and consistent than just looking at it. So that feels pretty good. I want to go into every corner. So I'll go ahead and do the same thing to the bottom tray. Now I should also mention, when you're sanding something like this, it's easy to miss certain parts. So I try to do this in a very consistent way. So I could do the inside every one, and if I'm doing that, I'll do one, and then I turn it clockwise, do the next one, do the next one. What I'm doing here on this, so I don't have to do it, turn it, whatever, 4 times, 4 times 4, 16 times. I'm doing each surface that's facing away from me. So 1, 2, 3. Oh, no, of course, I'm turning it the wrong way, but you get the idea. So do some kind of pattern so that you don't miss any spots. Not a big deal, but it's helpful. The box is all sanded now. I revisited the outside a little bit, but everything's ready to go. So I'm going to put the finish on next. The finish is oil varnish blend, which is a 3-part mix of linseed oil, mineral spirits, and varnish, or polyurethane. I had some varnish, interior varnish kicking around, so that's what I used. Before I put the finish on, and I'm only going to finish the outside of the box. If I finish the inside, particularly with the oil-based mix here, it's going to stink forever. So I'm not going to finish the inside. It's going to be fine. There's, what's going to go in here? Nothing damp. It's not going to get touched a lot. So I'm just going to leave the inside bare. Before I put the finish on, though, I want to raise the grain. Now I've sanded this to, I think, to 320 or 400. It's pretty smooth. But what I found is I used to sometimes raise the grain, sometimes not. And I found that, initially it felt exactly the same no matter what I did. But a year or two later, the ones that I did not raise the grain on did not feel as smooth. And I finally read somewhere that what happens is the moisture in the air, it comes and goes through the wood, and that moisture will raise the grain over time. So it's now whenever I put this type of finish on something, I always raise the grain before I put the finish on. So what I'm going to do, I've got a damp sponge here, and I'm just going to rub the moisture, I'm going to do this edge, into here, and I'll let that dry. I'll sand it one more time with the last grit, so 320, 400, and then I will go ahead and put the finish on. Okay, I've got everything wet, and just to speed things up, I used my heat gun to dry things off a little bit more quickly. So now I've got some 400 grit paper. I'll just lightly sand everything here. Feels nice and smooth. I did notice as I was doing this, the top still stayed pretty smooth. And I remembered the last thing I did to this was hand plane this surface. I sanded everything else. And when you've hand planed a surface, since you're shearing the fibers very cleanly, there's no grain to raise. You only raise grain when you've sanded and abraded things. So that still feels nice and smooth. So I'll go ahead and sand the rest of the walnut pieces, and we'll be ready to go here. Okay, I've blown everything off with some compressed air. I wiped everything off just with a dry rag. And now we'll put some finish on here. Now, normally when I'm using an oil varnish blend, I would brush it on, let it sit for a while, wipe it off, maybe 15, 20 minutes later. I don't want to put that much finish on here, so I'm just going to dip this in here and just wipe it on. And I'll probably put maybe two coats on here. You can see that walnut is really colorful. This is, remember, air-dried walnut, so it definitely has more color than the typical kiln-dried. the finish has sat for a little bit, maybe 5-10 minutes. So I'm just going to come back and wipe off any excess. And then I'll let it dry, and I'll probably put on maybe one more coat, and I'll kind of wait and see how it looks. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put the box together, and I'll show a couple pictures of how it looks when it's all done. So that's it for the mitered box.